Hey guys, we're back, and today we're talking about the African slave trade as part of the Atlantic Circuit or the Atlantic trading system. The Atlantic Circuit was a clockwise network of trade routes going from Europe to Africa, from Africa to the plantation colonies in the Americas, and this was actually referred to as the Middle Passage, and then from the colonies to Europe. Other trading routes included Europe to the Indian Ocean, Europe to the West Indies, New England to the West Indies, and triangular trade among New England, Africa, and the West Indies. As the Atlantic system developed, the increased demand for sugar in the 17th and 18th century, especially in Europe, was associated with the increase in the flow of slaves from Africa to the New World. And the slave trade was a highly specialized business in which chartered companies in the 17th century and then private traders in the 18th century at first purchased slaves in Africa and packed them into specially designed or modified ships and then would deliver them for sale to plantation colonies. This would later evolve into strictly raiding African kingdoms. Disease, maltreatment, suicide, and psychological depression all contributed to the average death rate of 1 out of every 6 slaves shipped on the Middle Passage. Disease was the single most important cause of death, killing the European crew of the slave ships at roughly the same rate as it killed the slaves themselves. So what I want you to take a look at here, guys, this is the actual trading system. So when we're looking at what is being sent from place to place, so feel free to pause that and take a look. But what I really want you to focus on for a minute are the sheer number of people who were taken from Africa and then sent throughout the Americas, Europe, and actually as part of the Indian Ocean trading system into parts of Asia. So some of these numbers that I never knew the extent of these numbers until I actually started teaching this class. The number of African slaves sent to South America, looking at Brazil, 2.1 million. To the West Indies, 3.8 million. When we're looking at North America, 400,000. We're looking at Europe, 50,000. Looking at the Red Sea, 550,000. As part of the Saharan slave trade network, 1.25 million people. The East African slave trade across the Indian Ocean, guys, 700,000 people. So these were all human lives that met a tragic end as part of the African slave trade. European trade with Africa grew tremendously after 1650 as merchants sought to purchase slaves and other goods. The growth in the slave trade was accompanied by the continued trade in other goods, but this did not lead to any significant European colonization of Africa. And African merchants were discriminating with the types and the amounts of merchandise they demanded in return for slaves and other goods. And they raised the price of slaves in response to increased demand. African governments on the Golden Slave Coast were strong enough to make Europeans observe African trading customs, while the Europeans, who were competing with each other for African trade, were unable to present a strong, united bargaining position. And the exchange of slaves for firearms contributed to the state formation in Gold and Slave Coasts. So, for example, the Kingdom of Dahomey used firearms acquired in the slave trade to expand its territory. The kingdoms of Oyo and Asante had interests in both the Atlantic trade and an overland trade with their northern neighbors. The African kings and merchants of the Golden Slave Coast obtained slaves from among the prisoners of war captured in conflicts between African kingdoms. However, it is unclear if slave taking was the motivation for these wars in the first place. The trade in African slaves transformed the military, political, and economic landscapes of West African societies, again, such as the kingdoms of Asante and the Congo. European trade with Africa grew tremendously after 1650 as merchants sought to purchase slaves and other goods. The growth in the slave trade was accompanied by continued trade in other goods. but it did not lead to any significant takeover until after the rise of imperialism. One of the things that we will see, guys, as we continue going through the rise of slavery and the rise of the slave trade, is that some of these African kingdoms benefited from a military standpoint because they were able to expand. And again, we referenced the Asante Kingdom and Dahomey. So the Asante Kingdom was a rising power in the forest region of West Africa in the 18th century. And before the transatlantic trade in slaves, slavery was simply a byproduct of war. Prisoners of war worked as slaves. Dahomey was another African state. They used the slave trade to increase their power. Dahomey kings traded slaves for guns, which gave them military superiority over their neighboring kingdoms. And then the slave trade would also transform the political systems in Africa. In the 16th century, Brazil was secondary to Portugal's efforts in the Indian Ocean when it came to Indian Ocean trading. And as we read on, you'll see the importance that Indian Ocean trade would play in the role of the rise of European power and conquests. Sugar plantations expanded north into the northeast of the country. And guys, what you need to know is that these sugar plantations that were in Brazil, that were in the West Indies, were some of the worst places that these people could possibly end up. The inhumane conditions, and that included the working conditions, the hours that African slaves were forced to work, the dangerous equipment they were forced to use. Disease would run rampant. The average life expectancy of an African slave living on a sugar plantation in Brazil or the West Indies was 3 to 5 years. And when we look at this number, guys, by 1800, there were about 150,000 African slaves in Brazil. That made up half the colony's population. That number I showed you before, we're looking at over 2 million people. That tells you the incredibly high death toll that working on these plantations led to. Brazil would develop an administration structure that was very similar to that of the Spanish colonies by having viceroys serve as governors. Brazil would actually, unlike other colonies who later fought for independence, Brazil would actually have a constitutional monarchy for a while with Portugal. African religions and culture were practiced throughout the slave populations of Brazil. And one thing we'll see as a rise of resistance are quilombos. And these are also referred to as war camps in a Brazilian hinterland. It's a settlement that was founded by the people of African origin and other inhabitants, typically other escaped slaves. And they called these quilombos, they were referred to as maroons. It's a term for a colony of escaped slaves. And the largest and most powerful quilombo was Palmares, which was around the early 17th century. West Indian society, which was the most polarized society in the world in the 18th century, consisted of very wealthy land-owning plantocracy, or the plantations, and their slaves, and then there were very few people in between. And a plantation had to extract as much labor as possible from its slaves in order to turn a profit. And slaves were organized into groups for field work, and then male slaves who were not doing field work were engaged in specialized tasks. And typically it was only African males who were brought to these plantations. Slaves were rewarded for good work, but they were punished harshly for failure to meet production quotas, or really for any form of resistance. On Sundays, slaves were allowed to cultivate their own food crops or do other chores, but they had very little time for rest or relaxation, no education, and little time for family life. Disease, harsh working conditions, and the dangerous mill machinery contributed to incredibly short life expectancies in the Caribbean. The high mortality rate added to the volume of the African slave trade, and it meant the majority of slaves on West Indian plantations were actually born in Africa. Slaves would frequently run away and occasionally staged violent rebellions. And one example is a rebellion led by a slave named Taki in Jamaica in 1760. And European planters sought to prevent these rebellions by trying to curtail African cultural traditions, religions, and languages. But religion was one way for slaves to assert their freedom within slave societies. In Brazil, manumission, or the voluntary freeing of slaves, was seen as an act of Christian charity. And in San Domingue, which is modern day Haiti, we'll talk more about San Domingue War for Independence later, there were three groups of people. And the majority of people in San Domingue were slaves. The majority were not free. In North America, manumission was incredibly rare. Another way that Africans preserved their culture was through food, and two of those foods are rice and okra. The rice that was brought to America and then grown in South Carolina was originally domesticated and grown in Africa. Before Columbus set foot in the New World, rice was already grown in Europe and Asia. But ships traveled the Indian Ocean. They introduced rice to Asia, later to Europe. But then when it came to the New World, colonial farmers grew it in the South. And this was helping to establish the Southern plantation and the use of slaves. Nobody knows where okra first appeared, but scientists believe the cultivation began as early as the 12th century, um, 12th century BCE in Ethiopia. And the plant most likely made it to the southern United States with the very beginning of the slave trade sometime in the 1500s. And okra, much like rice, was one of the few crops that slaves were able to bring with them from their communities in Western Africa. So there are a few resistance movements that I would like to discuss with you. One is a very famous movement led by Queen Anna Nzinga, and she was the ruler of Ndongo, which is present-day Angola. And Anna Nzinga formed an alliance with Portugal. And in forming this alliance with Portugal, the hope was to partner and then end the Portuguese slave raiding within the kingdom. And Anna Nzinga's baptism, with actually the Portuguese colonial governor serving as her godfather, sealed the relationship. But 2 years later, in 1626, Portugal betrayed the kingdom of Ndongo as well as Anna Nzinga. And she was forced to flee with her people further west, where they founded a new state of Matamba. And this was beyond the reach of the Portuguese. To bolster Matamba's power, Anna Nzinga offered sanctuary to runaway slaves. She formed a rebellion within the kingdom itself, and the kingdom of Ndongo was now indirectly ruled by Portuguese through a puppet ruler. Queen Anna found an ally in the Netherlands, but they actually seized the kingdom of Luanda for its own purposes. And this combined force between Queen Anna and the Netherlands was insufficient to drive the Portuguese out of Angola. And then the Portuguese actually claimed Luanda from the Dutch. So after this, Queen Anna Nzinga was forced to retreat back to Matamba. But after this, she focused on building up Matamba as a powerful trading kingdom. And she was actually able to reign here until her death in 1663. And they became a very formidable commercial state that dealt with the Portuguese colony on equal footing. Again, we would see the rise of Maroons. These are communities of runaway slaves. The Maroon Wars were another famous resistance movement that occurred in Jamaica. So in the interior mountainous regions of Jamaica, escaped slaves found a haven. They formed these communities, and the war that we're looking at in particular took place between 1728 and 1740. The second one between 1795 to 96. And these communities were seen as a threat to sugar plantations. But who we're looking at was a woman named Nanny, and she was referred to as the Queen of the Maroons, and today the mother of all Jamaicans. So she was known not only by the people in the Maroons, but also by British settlers as being an outstanding military leader who became a symbol of unity and strength for her people during times of crisis. She was incredibly important to them in a fierce fight with the British during the First Maroon War And the years that she was particularly active were between 1720 and 1739. And she's been immortalized in songs and legends. Certain facts about her are unknown, but the fact of what she did, her life, has been documented, and the actions that she took to protect her people. And finally, we're talking about capitalism and mercantilism. This is a system of royal monopoly control of colonies and their trade as practiced by Spain and Portugal in the 15th and 16th centuries. What we'll see happening are the rise of these institutions, capitalism and mercantilism. The mechanics of early capitalism included banks, joint stock companies, stock exchanges, and insurance. Mercantilism was a government-led promotion of private investment in overseas trade and accumulation of capital in the form of precious metals, usually gold and silver. Keep in mind, guys, so much silver was coming out of Potosi that it would lead to massive silver inflation throughout the world. At one point, silver was pretty much worthless in certain European kingdoms, as well as parts of Asia, specifically China, because there was just so much of it. Inflation is what happens when you have too much of a good of any kind. The instruments of this system include chartered companies such as the Dutch West India Company and the French Royal African Company, as well as the use of military force to pursue commercial dominance. The French and English limited Dutch competition from the Americas by defeating the Dutch in a series of wars between 1652 and 1678. The Dutch were seen as competition because of their system of wealth as well as the technology that they had. The French and the English then revoked the monopoly privileges of their charter companies, but continued to use high tariffs to prevent foreigners from gaining access to trade with their colonies. So the whole point of this system is the colony is there to benefit the mother country. The Atlantic became the major trading area for the British, the French, and the Portuguese in the 18th century. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, send me an email. Otherwise, have a great day, y'all. Cheers.